It's Tuesday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me, Conservative MP Bim Afalami, Labour MP Belle Ribeiro Addy, TUC General Secretary Francis O'Grady and LBC radio presenter Ian Dale. Today,
the vaccine is safe and people should certainly continue to take it to protect themselves and protect their friends and family.
Regulators here and abroad agree and back the AstraZeneca vaccine. So why have these European countries now paused its use? The government says it's taking immediate steps to make women and girls safer.
Too many of us have clutched our keys in our fists in case we need to defend ourselves.
How does it make women safer on the streets? The simple answer is that it does nothing.
The virus is deadly, yeah, I tell you, lads, eh?
This was Cheltenham races a year ago. Will voters remember early mistakes in the pandemic? Let's start with one of the stories in the headlines, that more countries are pausing their rollout of the AstraZeneca vaccine. Let's show you a couple of the front pages. The Daily Mail headlines it like this: Reckless EU snubs UK jab. And this is how the Financial Times sees it. AstraZeneca jab rollout paused in Europe over blood clot fears. Before we go to our panel, I'd like to welcome Dr. Michael Head. He is the Senior Global Research Fellow at the University of Southampton. Welcome to the programme. Dr. Head, you'll know people, millions of them have had this vaccine. Many more are about to. Is there any cause for concern?
Good afternoon. I can't see any obvious cause for concern with this. What we have seen is a possible small signal where there's been an increased number of blood clots soon after vaccination. In Germany, the data suggests that it's slightly above what you would expect to see normally anyway across a population, but not massively elevated. So I'm quite curious as to why countries have chosen to pause their vaccination campaigns based on that possible small signal. It's right that regulators investigate it, but pausing a vaccine rollout during a pandemic seems to be a bit strange at this point in time.
Well, and as you said, you'd like to know why they've done it, which is the question I'm sure is being posed. We can show a map of the number of countries that have paused administering the AstraZeneca vaccine, and it is quite a large number and a growing number, it seems, just at the moment, and yet it flies in the face of regulators here and across Europe and real-world evidence. Do you have any idea why that might be?
No, I am. I said yesterday that I was baffled as to why countries have paused, and I remain baffled right now. As you say, we will hear more later today from the EMA, the European regulators, and also the World Health Organization. But here in the UK, we've administered 10 million doses of the AstraZeneca vaccine, and there's been no noted signal. And this has been investigated, of course. So this slightly elevated possible risk from blood clots, going from about 5 per million population to about 7, if you compare that with the chances of dying in the UK from COVID-19 of the last year, that's about 2,000 deaths per million. So the risk-reward ratio here still seems to be overwhelmingly in favour of keeping the vaccines going. So yeah, I'm still unsure as to why some countries have paused it at this point.
All right, thank you very much. Bim, are you worried at all about the impact it might have on take-up of the vaccine here?
Well, I'm concerned about it because I don't want one person watching this or having read the newspapers this morning to think that they don't want to take the vaccine that we know is safe. As Dr. Head explained, we have real-world evidence of the safety of this vaccine, of 10 million doses in this country over several weeks. And frankly, I think the European Union's whole attitude to the vaccination programme, because of Britain's decision to pursue an independent special strategy, for me has been very odd for many weeks. And this is the latest in a series of quite odd decisions from many countries in the European Union.
Belle, what about you? Do you have any concerns at all about the take-up and whether this will affect it?
Yes, I definitely do have concerns. I think because there have been so many issues in the past regarding the vaccine, anything that reduces public confidence in the vaccine is a problem. We've also seen there are some communities that have a lot of vaccine hesitation within them and are quite concerned about the impact that this might have. I think it's important that we continue to restore confidence that people can safely take the vaccine. But I'm guessing that the other countries, in response to their own vaccine hesitancy, are taking those measures as well. And I think that's what's causing the problem. And unfortunately, we live in an increasingly globalised world. News travels.
Right. I mean, in terms of news travelling, Ian, Bell mentions issues with the vaccine. Do you see those more political in origin rather than actually medical?
Well, the Daily Mail are making the point that it's the EU that are behind this, but there are countries outside the EU that have done this as well. So they're basically saying, well, they're all anti-British and all the rest of it and want to undermine the British vaccine. But I think one question which has to be asked is, if they're doing this with AstraZeneca, why haven't they done it with the Pfizer vaccine? Because the figures for the Pfizer vaccine are almost identical to the AstraZeneca one. Now, if you want to indulge in a little bit of conspiracy theory, look at the fact that AstraZeneca aren't making a profit from their vaccine, whereas all the other drug companies are. And drug companies are very powerful lobbyists in Brussels. Now, I have no idea whether that they might be exerting undue influence. But as Michael said, he's baffled. We are all baffled by this because, as he says, the risk-reward would indicate that you wouldn't do something like this. And the long-term issue will be, and there is anecdotal evidence of this, that people are now going into vaccination centres today and are refusing to take the AstraZeneca vaccine. And I think it's a gross dereliction of duty on the part of those who are behind this.
Michael, just before we go to our final panellist, the point that's raised there by Ian Dale is that this has been an issue, albeit small, for Pfizer too. So why haven't they been sort of highlighted in the same way?
Well, it's a good question. I don't know or understand the politics behind it all. It does seem that AstraZeneca has been a bit of a political football over the last few weeks for reasons that certainly I don't understand, and certainly colleagues on this programme will have a better grasp of that than I do. But yeah, you're right. So yeah, Pfizer has kind of sort of similar levels of observed side effects and similar possible adverse events like these blood clots, which are not thought to be related to the vaccine. I think if we paused a vaccine rollout every time we saw a signal of this low magnitude, there wouldn't be a vaccine rollout at all. So ultimately, if we don't get large numbers of each population in each country vaccinated, the pandemic continues. So this does seem a strange move by all these countries concerned. So hopefully we will get more information from the EMA and the WHO later today, and the countries will start to reinstate the AstraZeneca vaccine in their schedules. Well,
Francis, it's an important point, isn't it? Because although it may be OK here and people will continue to take the AstraZeneca vaccine, it is a global effort in terms of inoculating as many people as possible around the world. Otherwise, the pandemic goes on.
It is. I had my jab about a week ago and I was just reflecting on why it's been such a success in Britain. And I think a lot of it's down to trust, that we really trust our NHS and the people who work in it. And, you know, my experience of getting the jab, they were just fantastic. The Francis Crick Centre, they were just efficient, but friendly and humane. So I think trust is a big factor. But you're right that this really matters for all of us, because not just in Europe, if you look at poor countries, they expect only 1 in 10 people to have had the jab by the end of the year. And of course, that risks new mutant strains developing, which threaten us all. So there has to be an international effort and some international leadership, including making sure that the intellectual property of vaccines is shared so that poor countries in the world can join that race to vaccinate against mutant strains.
Dr Head, thank you very much for joining us. We're going to move on and talk about the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill. We talked about it yesterday. There was a long debate in the House of Commons. That continues. I just want to show you this headline in the Daily Mirror. 10 years for statue attack, 5 for rape. This was the point that was picked up by the Labour leader, Keir Starmer. He tweeted, attacking a statue equals 10 years in prison, rape sentences equals 5 years in prison. Nothing on outlawing street harassment. Labour won't support the Conservatives' bill, which doesn't tackle violence against women and girls. The Justice Secretary responded, Robert Buckland, with this tweet: disappointing to see Keir misrepresent sentencing policy like this. The average sentence for rape is 9 years, 9 months, and the maximum is life. Our reforms will mean longer prison sentences or terms for sex offenders, but Labour is voting against them. Belle, do you agree with the Justice Secretary that we should look at the average sentences for particular crimes rather than the possible minimum and maximum sentences?
No, I don't agree, because it's evidently clear what is happening in the sense of rape cases. People are getting lower and lower sentences, and less women are coming forward. And when they do come forward, they're being dragged through some of the most horrendous processes, sometimes to no avail. So I think looking at it like that is wrong.
Right, except, do you accept that the average sentence, according to the Justice Secretary, for rape is actually 9 years, 9 months, and the maximum sentence is life?
Well, that's what it says. However, I don't believe that that's what's happening the majority of the time. What we're actually finding is whilst that may be the average sentence, some people that barely anybody is being sentenced, and that's the problem. And people are calling it, saying it's effectively decriminalising rape. So when someone finally does get charged, if that's their average sentence, fine. But if all of these are not getting to a situation where people actually have to do time for what they've done,
and that's an important point. We're going to come on to that in a little bit more detail. But Bim, before we move on, just on this particular point, do you accept what Keir Starmer is saying, that it is at least possible for someone to get a longer prison sentence for attacking a statue than for attacking a woman?
Well, I think, Joe, to be honest, you made the point very well to my Labour colleague that you can't just take an absolute minimum and compare it to an absolute maximum.
Right.
What's important is what, A, the average time, B, the potential maximum from the most serious offences, and also, and this is to take up my Labour colleague's point very directly, yes, the process and how many people we can actually get convicted, and we need to continue improving that, but also how early people are released. You know, the Labour government, when they were in office, had halfway release for rape and serious sexual offences. We've ended that in this bill. That's another issue, because it's not just the sentence, it's actually how long people spend in jail.
There have been various Labour leaderships since that time, and the past government has been in power for 10 years. To keep continuously blaming a Labour government from over a decade ago for things that you could have changed in the past decade, it just has to stop. It's absolutely ridiculous. Are the Conservatives in power or not? And why would it?
Well, let me say something else. Something else that has to stop is somebody as experienced in these matters as Keir Starmer. He's very experienced in these matters from his previous career, willfully misleading the public when he knows that the maximum sentence for rape is life and that it's 10 years on average. That is the sort of thing that has to stop, and it demeans our politics.
Belle?
Yes, but if rape prosecutions have gone down to the lowest level since records began, when at the same time more people are coming forward and reporting rape, then that's clearly a failure of the justice system, and the government of the day should be doing something to solve that. And many members of parliament from across the House, different organisations like End Violence Against Women have been making this point to the government again and again, and nothing has changed. And instead, we're having this new piece of legislation, which, as far as I'm concerned, in its way of restricting the right to protest, is silencing women's voices, whilst at the same time valuing statues. I mean, what we value in society is quite clear from the fact that most of these statues are of men. They're made of stone, they're made of metal, and they are now being valued above women.
All right,
you damage one of these statues, you get up to 10 years. You violate a woman, you get 5, if that.
Let me go to Ian and Francis, because we're covering this idea of comparison because it's how it's developed in the news. But is it really making a fair comparison at all, Ian, in terms of the possible sentences that can be handed out for rape and criminal damage, essentially?
Well, perception is often greater than reality. And if you perceive that damaging a statue is going to get you a longer sentence than if you attack a woman, whether sexual attack or domestic violence or whatever, that is not a good perception. And I'm afraid that's the narrative that's developed on this. And I think this is one of those occasions where I mean, Bell is right in a lot of what she says, and so is Bim. It's rare in politics that people can be right from different sides of the fence. It depends what angle you're looking at. But where I really do agree with Bell is that it kind of does avoid the main issue. And the main issue is that fewer and fewer women have the confidence to come forward to say they've been attacked, whether it's a sexual attack or rape, whatever. And that's what the government needs to address. Not just the government, the police and the CPS need to address that. I've heard horror stories of women who've been viciously attacked, but I thought, what's the point in reporting this? Because I'll go through agony and I've got no confidence that I will get justice in the end. That's what legislation should be concentrating on. Yes, have higher sentences, and I totally agree with Bim that people should not be let out automatically at halfway, people who've committed sexual offences. So that's something you would hope that Labour would support it in the bill. But this has become far too politicised in many ways. And OK, sometimes when I say that, they say, oh, it's motherhood and apple pie. You just want everyone to get along. Yeah. Well, on this, why should there be a political divide? Surely everyone wants the same outcome.
Right. Well, on your very point, it is borne out in the statistics, as you rightly say. If we show our viewers this graph, most rapes aren't solved. These are figures for England and Wales 2019-2020. And it's very stark. Police recorded rape. The number is over 55,000. Rape convictions is just over 1,400. Francis, looking at those figures, is Ian right that actually the focus from both Labour and the Conservatives on this should be on convictions and why there aren't more of them when you look at the numbers that are actually being reported to the police?
The focus should be on women and ending violence. And not just violence, harassment, everyday sexism that we experience in the street, on public transport, at work and in the home. And it's time for it to end. And that's what politicians should be focused on, a real strategy to end that behaviour wherever it rears its head. But I think we need some honesty here, because that policing bill was conceived by the Home Secretary, who wanted to look tough about people toppling statues of slave traders and impose tougher sentences for them, as we've heard, than many men get for raping a real-life woman. And it's backfired badly. The handling of the protest, and I very much suspect that the Home Secretary's advice to the Chief Constable was to get tough on those women who are holding a vigil. And it's backfired. It's backfired. There are some other nasty bits in this bill, I have to say, more of these so-called culture wars, including picking on gypsy and traveller communities who still, many of them, need somewhere to live. Local authorities don't have the money or the duty to provide it. It's a nasty, nasty bill. Well, and instead, what we should be focusing on is how do we make working lives and life in the home and in our communities safe and respectful to women.
All right, well, let's go back. As you say, it's a wide-ranging bill. It covers all sorts of areas. We talked quite a lot about the right to protest yesterday. I'd like to return to the point that you ended on there, Francis, about women and about protecting them. Bim, the accusation there from Francis O'Grady that actually what the government has done is use longer sentences, if you like, as a way of masking the issue that was shown in that graph is that there just aren't enough cases when it comes to rape making it to court.
Look, I think it's not an either or. I think you've got to do both. I think that longer sentences are important, and we've talked about that already, and I think that does matter. But at the same time, we need to improve. We need to improve those statistics that you showed. 1,000, 1,400 compared to 55,000. We all know that isn't good enough.
But what's the cause of those? What's the cause of those statistics? I mean, during the last 5 years, cases reported to police have risen sharply. They've gone up, but the proportion of rape prosecutions in that same period has more than halved. Why? I'm
afraid these things are very, very complicated, and it's multifaceted. I suspect the reasons are many, but I think the important thing is that we need to look at all the different angles. There's a CPS issue with that. We need to make sure the CPS has the support they need. There are things we should look at in terms of rules of evidence, how women are treated when they when they talk about these issues in court, if it gets that far, indeed with the police. There's a range of different things, and we definitely need to focus on that. But the way of us doing that is not to then say misleading things about sentencing. I think that we need to do both and improve on both areas. With this bill, it's a piece of primary legislation. We're improving on the sentencing. And yes, at the same time, we need to make sure that the numerous criminal justice acts that we have, we need to enforce them properly and more effectively in relation to rape and indeed many other cases as well. And I just would like to add one thing about statutes. It's come up already. This is not just about statues. It means any sort of memorial. I think people out there who have gravestones that they visit from a loved one, or war memorials, or various other things, people feel very strongly about lots of different things. To sort of say, oh, it's all about statues of people hundreds of years ago is incorrect. And I think it's very, very important that the viewers of this programme understand that.
Right, Belle, do you want to just pick up on that point? That in some cases this is about... Hang on, Francis, I will come to you. I just wanted to get Belle's response that these are war memorials that they're talking about in the bill. Belle?
Well, I'm so sorry, my internet connection has gone.
Don't worry, that is a hazard.
What was your question? I heard war memorials after a long gap.
It was just in response to what Bim was saying, that when we talk about statues, sometimes we are also talking about war memorials, not just statues of former slave traders.
Yes, absolutely. We're talking about a range of different memorials. However, the fact remains is that these are still given a higher importance in this bill in particular than attacking a woman. And that's the point that people are trying to make, just drawing that illustration. I don't think we're making misleading statements about sentencing because, as we've just proven, as we've just discussed, not a lot of these cases are going to court. And that's a serious issue. We have to change the culture of how we view violence against women and girls. And I suppose part of changing that culture would actually be to show people, as a parliament, what we value. And we do that through our legislation. And this piece of legislation shows that we don't value women because it makes no very specific measures to tackle violence against women and girls when we know that that is so badly needed.
Bim, you're shaking your head.
Well, I mean, if we in this piece of legislation, we talk about rape, sexual assault, and that is a crime that predominantly, overwhelmingly affects women. What saddens me about this debate is you've got the Labour Party trying to play political points with this issue and then say, oh, we need a change of culture. Well, the way how we get a change of culture is for people to work together, look at what we can build on positively in this bill, set previous mistakes, work together to look forward and say, how can we improve enforcement? How do we make sure we can get the rape convictions up? The way you do that is not just to score political points on what clearly is intended.
All right.
To be tougher sentences for rape, tougher sentences.
Let me let Francis come in.
Wish that the government would start listening to women. Nobody wants political point scoring on this, but we do want a justice and criminal service that works for women. I do want a guard on the train when I'm travelling. It makes me feel safer. I do want to know why half of our police stations have been closed down and we've had real cuts on the ground to community policing, which we know is vital to policing by consent. So, let's get real. Let's start listening to women and let's have a joined up strategy, as I say, at work and in the home and on the street and on social media too.
All right, I just give the final word to Ian.
One of the main reasons that so few cases come to court is because the CPS have raised the evidential bar. Now we have to ask, well, why have they done that? We hear that there have been lots of financial cuts to the CPS, so they feel that they can't let as many cases go to court as maybe they had done before. I think that's where the bottleneck is, as well as the attitude of some police in terms of interviewing women who've been raped. I mean, we've all heard the horror stories of, I know a couple of women who've been to the police who, and I get calls on this on my radio show all the time from women who feel that they are just not treated correctly. Either they're interviewed by male officers or even if they're interviewed by female officers, they feel as if they're not being believed. They feel as if all the questions are, well, why did you provoke this attack or how did you provoke this attack, and that is not the way to interview victims of sexual assault.
All right, we're going to leave it there and move on because we've been joined by the BBC's political editor, Laura Kunsberg. Laura, you've been investigating the decisions made by the government early on in this pandemic, and that's as we reach the anniversary of the first lockdown. You've spoken to a variety of people, including Matt Hancock, the Health Secretary. Just let's listen to him responding to questions about what was going on last March.
This was growing fast, and the thing that was really worrying and the thing that really sticks in my mind is that we had those reasonable worst-case scenarios of hundreds of thousands of deaths, and the problem with them was that they were coming true. So we knew we had to act, and that Monday I went to Parliament and said that all unnecessary social contact should be stopped.
Can you give us a bit of context to what the Health Secretary was talking about there?
Yes, I mean, for this project, we've talked to more than 20 people who were involved in making the decisions over the last 12 months off the record. But what Matt Hancock is responding to there is something that we discovered about really the moment when the Prime Minister suddenly realised this is on course for something very significant and something that could be disastrous. He's talking about a meeting on the morning of Saturday the 14th of March when government had been talking about coronavirus, there had been COBRA meetings, the Prime Minister had started giving press conferences and had set out this plan called Contain and then Delay. But at that point, they were still allowing mass gatherings going ahead. They were still saying that we could all, be going at work. But at this meeting on the Saturday the 14th of March, officials basically had rerun the numbers and thought on the current plan, if things go ahead like this, the NHS is at risk of collapse. And it was at that moment that a small group in Downing Street said, OK, foot on the pedal, everything now has to be accelerated. And it's one of the real insights that we've been able to find out, because there's been so much written and agonised over the speed of lockdown. Was it too late, too early? But we've been able to find out about that specific moment when really, for Boris Johnson, it was suddenly beyond conclusive that things had to happen.
And that was that particular moment reflected on by the Health Secretary. You spoke to him on the record. You've also spoken to many people off the record, senior politicians. And what have you gleaned?
Well, the really interesting things, Joe, I mean, there's so much really, but first of all is just in that early period, how blind they were. The government had been talking about this since January, but there was so much that they didn't know. And those early decisions were taken in a context where nobody knew that the disease could spread if people didn't have symptoms. Patrick Vallance, Chris Whitty, the scientists, they still thought mass gatherings were OK. Nobody really thought
Cheltenham, it was about a year ago, wasn't it? We were showing pictures at the beginning of the programme.
Exactly. There wasn't conclusive evidence about masks. They didn't know how fast the disease had been spreading. They didn't know that it was already here in large number, having been brought back into this country from people who'd been on half-term breaks in the Alps. So that real feeling of being blind, and there's one quote that really stuck in my mind that somebody said we felt really blind and we were more blind than we were able to tell the public, which is very interesting and has really struck me in all of this. The other thing that came across very strongly, despite the fact that a lot of action has been taken, the government's done massive interventions, but the Prime Minister's own personal unease with the idea of restrictions, that has come back again and again in the course of these conversations. And particularly people in government have been very critical of tweaking with restrictions in September rather than bringing in more aggressive actions at that point when the second wave was just starting to take off.
Right, well, that is a pretty damning picture of the sort of early days, weeks of the pandemic. Ben, would you agree?
Well, look, let's see once the report's fully out, when I have a chance to look at it. What I would say is that the Prime Minister had to make some incredibly difficult decisions, as everybody knows. And it's not wrong for a Prime Minister to feel unease about imposing huge restrictions on our lives. That is not a wrong impulse for a Prime Minister to have. But when he has the evidence and he satisfies himself that those things need to be done, then he did it and he acted. And it's always very easy after the event for everybody to say, oh, well, this should have happened a week earlier, a day earlier, or whatever. But at the time, there was such a lack of knowledge about this disease that the government did absolutely everything it could with the information it had.
Right. Do you accept that, Bill? You're shaking your head, so you don't.
No, I don't accept it. And I don't accept it from personal experience. Last year, during the budget, we were all crammed together in the chamber, as usual, like nothing had happened. And by that time, all across the world, people had started cancelling their gatherings. And we were still allowing people to come in and have events, not just meetings, but events in Parliament. And I remember there was a statement at the end of that day about coronavirus. And I got up, I was a relatively new MP at the time. I got up and I spoke about how I thought that a number of people already had the coronavirus, and we need to consider a lockdown. We need to consider shutting down Parliament itself. And I was jeered by the Conservative benches. Now I started to feel flush. I thought I was just embarrassed. First time as a new MP I'd ever been shouted at by the other side. But I went home and I continued to feel flush. And I woke up the next day and I had coronavirus symptoms. It was not a great case at all. I spent one night in A&E, and it took a good few weeks for me to get over it. So no, I will not forget how badly it was handled at the beginning, when all across the world people were taking appropriate measures, and neither will the families of the 130,000 people that have died.
All right, Bim, do you want to respond to that? Because there were many politicians, including, of course, as we know, Boris Johnson himself, who contracted coronavirus in those early days.
Yes, I mean, the only thing I'll say is that this was a pretty much unprecedented situation, or at least in living memory. The government took the actions that we needed to. In hindsight, people will always look back and say, well, this could have happened, that should have been done at that time. But the balance of imposing restrictions and also seeing the costs of different interventions as well is something that we'll be living with for a very long time. And what the important thing is, as time has gone on, our increased knowledge and understanding about the disease and the ways of how to manage it, the scientific community, not just with the vaccine, but their incredible abilities to improve the drugs and the treatments, have done huge things. The NHS obviously deserves huge credit for that. So I just think as time has gone on, we have increasingly got better and better handling the disease, and the vaccine rollout that's currently going on, a very good example of how we've improved and kept improving, and hopefully, we can continue that vaccine rollout as one of the leaders, if not the leader in the world.
Well, we're going to talk about that in just a moment, but we've sort of really discussed the early days, but of course there were people who were critical of the action, or perhaps the lack of action, later on last year.
And I think there's a real distinction in what we found out. You know, there are a lot of people who say that March everything was unknown. We were scrambling, we did our best, it accelerated very quickly. But there are a lot of people who were intimately involved who, when you talk to them about it, are really very regretful and even quite angry about what happened in September. I mean, somebody who was very involved in the decision-making said to me, we kept repeating the same mistakes again and again and again. We lost a lot of time. That led to more cases, which in turn led to more deaths. Another very senior figure talked to me about a sense of denial when the second wave was starting to arrive. So there's a sort of sense of, at the beginning, OK, people involved think nobody knew. It was blind. These decisions, just how hard this all was, right? It was a real dilemma. And in that period, in the late summer, early autumn, they were hoping that test and trace would be up and running in order to help manage that second wave. But it couldn't cope in September when universities and schools all went back. And that is part of the problem too here. So it's a complicated picture.
Right. Well, let's actually have a look at the judgments that are being made by people, by voters. Because this story in The Guardian, which headlines, Tories could benefit from vaccine bounce in May's local elections in England. And this will be a big electoral test. You know, will it be a test on the handling by the government of COVID? Or will people think, and will they benefit from this mass vaccination?
Well, there's going to be a huge set of elections in May, actually. We haven't talked about this very much, really, because everybody's been quite rightly so focused on the pandemic. It's a massive set of elections happening in May. And if you look at it, some people in the Labour Party sort of say privately, well, look, the economy's had a terrible time. Thousands and thousands of people have very tragically lost their lives, and yet the Tories are comfortably, you know, where they're at in the polls. And there is a belief in Labour leadership that there is something of a vaccine bounce. That does seem to be a real thing. But, you know, it is a huge set of national elections, and you just wonder what will be in people's minds when they go into the polling booths. Don't forget also elections in Wales and Scotland too, and there'll be on all sorts of interesting things. Maybe there'll even an interesting by-election too.
Oh, yes, so we have just been told that that could happen at the same time.
That's right. The Labour MP for Hartlepool is leaving, standing down immediately, and there is just about time to get on for a by-election on that same day, which would be really fascinating to see.
Well, they're a big set of elections. Ian, how do you view them in terms of whether or not people blame the government for the pandemic and whether they will give them the benefit of the doubt over the vaccine?
Well, if you look at the polls, I think it is astonishing that the Conservatives are 7. I think there was a poll yesterday showing them 10 points ahead. And you think, well, why is that? that it is easy to attribute it to a so-called vaccine bounce. That would indicate that people's memories are rather shorter than maybe the Labour Party would like them to be, because, as you've discussed, inevitably mistakes were made at the beginning. The lockdown, and I think we can probably all agree that in hindsight, and it's easy to say in hindsight, lockdown should have happened probably a week earlier. But if you remember, the scientific advice from SAGE and Patrick Vallance and Chris Whitty was that if you go into lockdown too early, people won't respect it the longer it goes on. So they were not advising, I mean, Laura, you can correct me on this, but my recollection is that the meeting of SAGE on the 17th of March did not advise an immediate lockdown, and it did happen a week later. And if the government then went against the medical and scientific advice, can you imagine what the outcry would have been? So I think the electorate probably cut the government a bit more slack than maybe political commentators do, because they think, well, who would have got it all right? And you look at what's happened in France, right. Very, very similar to this country in many ways. Very stringent lockdowns, but the number of cases now in France is going up all the time compared to here.
Right. Francis, do you take the point on the following the scientific advice there?
I think this is one reason why we need that independent public inquiry, so that we see the evidence and we can make our own minds up. But I think without doubt the government is getting a vaccine bounce. But I don't think people will forget that they've rewarded our NHS staff with a real pay cut, or that that's what they're planning on. I don't think they'll forget what happened in social care, the scandal of how elderly people were treated, and social care workers, most of them on the minimum wage, many on 0 hours contracts, wrapping themselves in bin liners. And they can't forget, we advised the government right at the start of this pandemic that we needed to sort out sick pay so that test and trace could work. It couldn't work unless people felt financially secure enough to take time out to self-isolate. Otherwise, they couldn't afford to feed their families. So, you know, I think there is plenty that people won't forget. Sure. We're way off the general election yet. Yeah. When we get there, I suspect that's when the reckoning will happen.
Right, Bim?
Well, I think that the reason why the Conservative Party at the moment appears to be doing reasonably well in the polls is many reasons. I actually think the biggest one is I think people have found out Keir Starmer. You know, I think that the Labour Party and Keir Starmer started well. He appeared to start quite well, but actually over time, his inability to make clear decisions. You know, we saw in the run-up to the budget his difficulties on whether they were in favour of raising taxes or cutting them, and his inability to do that. I think a lot of people across the political spectrum, indeed in his own party, starting to lose faith in him. Because the most interesting thing, if you actually look at the polls, what's happened to the Labour Party, the Conservative, what's happening to the Labour Party's rate. And I think the Labour Party and people who support them saying, oh, well, it's just because of the vaccine rollout. Actually, I think people take a range of different things into account when they make political decisions. They know that the government has their long-term interests at heart, not just in health and vaccines, but also with the economy.
Well, hang on, Belle, I'm just going to show very briefly, Belle, on the back of what Bim has said, this graph about Keir Starmer net satisfaction, Ipsos Mori poll, and it shows, let's just take among Labour voters at the top, it's gone down in June 2020 from 66% to 19%. So that is the net satisfaction with Keir Starmer. Do you think there is a problem there with the leadership?
Well, we all know that polls can change very quickly. And if we're talking about vaccinations, if you remember, Keir Starmer was the one that rolled out the Let's Vaccinate Britain campaign before the government got on top of it. And actually, I think it is very disappointing if the government might be benefiting from what's called a vaccine bounce, because actually the vaccine rollout hasn't been their success. We think about the things that the government had control over, things such as track and trace, giving £37 billion to private companies.
You don't think that the vaccine rollout's been a success?
No, I don't think it's the government's success. I think the vaccine rollout, as it is a success, is an example of what the NHS can do when you give it the funds that it needs. And that's 100% the fact. And part of the reason why we find ourselves in this difficult situation is because the NHS was so cash-strapped, you know, in the past decade. And when they've given them the resources they need, everything they've needed, the vaccine rollout has been a complete success. So it's the NHS success, all of those staff, all of those volunteers, they should take the credit, not the government.
Ian?
Well, it's very easy to blame the government when anything goes wrong, and then when something does go right, you don't give the government any credit at all. That's what people don't like about politicians. Give credit where credit's due. You're right, it is the people who, at the sharp end, who've been rolling it out, who deserve most of the credit. But I mean, this has been a success. It could have been an awful failure, just as we've seen it be an awful failure in many, many European countries. It hasn't been a failure in this country. And if you can't bring yourself to actually utter the words for once, the government have done well on this, I think that's a shame.
All right. Laura, just sort of in response, listening to that discussion, it will be interesting to see what voters use in terms of their judgments, whether it is on the vaccination, on the decisions made through the pandemic, on other issues leading up to those elections in May.
It will be fascinating. You know, in a sense, all politics is local, but we have been through the most astonishing year politically, personally, as a country. You know, everybody's been through the mill in one way or another. But the vaccine story in and of itself is something really fascinating. And one of the things we've been able to dig up in this report is actually how the government made those early calls to, you know, suspend normal processes, give the Department of Health a big checkbook, and actually how secretive and how much of a gamble a lot of it was. I mean, somebody very senior said to me, imagine if we'd spent all that taxpayers' money, more than £13 billion, and it hadn't come off. Then he'd be having some very, very difficult questions. And one final thought, people might be interested to know, it was also secretive that in discussions in Whitehall, people weren't allowed to reveal which vaccines they were actually talking about because of commercial confidentiality. So they all had code names named after submarines, and Pfizer was known as the Ambush and AstraZeneca was known as Triumph.
Oh.
Some people might say fittingly so. I think Boris Johnson would certainly feel that way.
Well, Francis, you wanted to come in a little bit earlier in terms of the discussion on whether the government has been successful in its rollout of the vaccine.
I think it's massive credit to NHS staff, and I think that's why people will be questioning whether we're rewarding those staff that we were all out on the doorstep clapping fairly and decently. In fact, it almost goes deeper than the money. I think these are people who, every time they put the uniform on, are putting the health of themselves and their families on the line for the rest of us. And I think there will be a feeling in the public. It may not get expressed in these local elections, but I think people are decent and they want to see NHS staff and all key workers treated decently.
Well, let Bim respond to that.
So I speak as somebody whose father's an NHS anaesthetist. The first thing is, of course, the NHS staff have been key in the rollout of the vaccine, but also it's been a model of public and private sector working together. You know, if you look at what the private sector has done to get the vaccine up and running, tested, and then approved by the public sector regulator, and then working with the NHS to roll it out, and many volunteers, and I see that in my own constituency, you know, actually, it's the public and private sector working together, and we shouldn't forget that. The private sector matters here too. And in relation to the broader point about, you know, who, NHS staff, it's absolutely key that we reward NHS staff properly. And it's true that the NHS staff are the only, public sector members of staff who will get pay rises. The pay rises are above inflation, but at the same time, we have to make sure that everything is in proportion. We know that so many people in the private sector's pay has been cut. That's if they still have their jobs. Many people have lost their jobs. And we have to bear all those things in mind.
All right, we've run out of time. I know Francis and Belle don't agree with you, and we'll have to get you on again, won't we, to talk about it further. But thanks very much to Laura, and you'll be able to see your full report. It's called COVID Confidential on the iPlayer later, or you can read about it on the BBC News website now. From all of us here, bye-bye.